Good morning and thanks for tuning in. You're watching All You Need to Know on Bloomberg Quint Live and I'm Alex Matthew. First, the headlines. US President Donald Trump has delayed the imposition of 5% additional tariffs on $250 billion of Chinese goods by 2 weeks in order to avoid clashing with China's 70th anniversary celebrations. Asian markets have jumped post the news. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange has made an unsolicited bid of $36.6 billion to acquire the London Stock Exchange. The LSE board is yet to take a call on the proposed merger. Apollo Hospital promoter Sunita Reddy is set to sell 3.6% stake in the company. The floor price of 1,450 crore rupees per share is a 3% discount to Wednesday's closing price. And SBI will be selling up to 4.5% stake in SBI Life Insurance via the offer for sale rather. This is in order to comply with minimum shareholding norms. Let's talk about the US markets now. On Wall Street, stocks continued to rise. The S&P 500 climbed to its highest level in 2 months as sentiment continued to remain risk-on over rising trade optimism. Abigail Doolittle of Bloomberg News brings you Wednesday's Wall Street session in this report.
Stocks finished higher in Wednesday's Wall Street session, solidly higher, in fact, after the choppy trading seen on both Monday and Tuesday. The Dow, the S&P 500, and the Nasdaq all closed higher by more than 0.7%. The tech-heavy Nasdaq really leading the way, up more than 1%. Now, before turning to sector composition, oil was a big story because around noon Eastern time, oil reversed a solid gain to actually trade sharply lower toward the end of the session, down more than 2%. This on a Bloomberg scoop that President Trump had considered lifting sanctions against Iran. So on that, we did have oil fall. That actually took the energy sector closer to even, flip-flopping between gains and losses on the day. But not surprisingly, with the tech-heavy Nasdaq outperforming, tech was a strong sector on the day for the first time this week. One of the better stocks there, Apple, up for a second day in a row around the company's product event launch. Investors enthusiastic about those new products, sending those shares higher. We also had the likes of Salesforce.com trading higher, along with Intel and Cisco. So again, tech was a pretty strong spot for the markets on Wednesday. Oil, not as much. And interestingly, we did actually have bonds trade slightly higher, actually flip-flopping on the day, which is not necessarily a risk-on signal, but with the strength out of stocks and the fact that the momentum group, there's been a lot of talk about a rotation out of the momentum stocks into the value. Momentum actually traded higher on Wednesday, probably a lot of that having to do with the tech strength. There was an interesting pause, at least, in the selling there. Overall, Wednesday's Wall Street session, with stocks higher, was risk-on. In New York, Abigail Doolittle, Bloomberg News.
Now, the big story this morning is the fact that US President Donald Trump has delayed the imposition of an additional 5% tariff on Chinese goods to the extent of $250 billion. Trump tweeted that he is delaying the tariff imposition at the request of Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and as a goodwill gesture to mark the 70th anniversary of China. Anna Edgerton of Bloomberg News gets you more details.
Probably a little bit of both. This probably is a bit of a goodwill gesture that will set the stage for talks between American officials and Chinese officials coming up at the end of this month and the beginning of next month. But there are also signs of the impact of these tariffs on U.S. consumers, and there's increasing concern about the effect that it's having on the U.S. economy. This is something that President Trump is very worried about, especially as he prepares to seek re-election next year, with really mostly the economy to run on. It's his strongest point, his strongest case for re-election, and that's really what he wants to keep on going strong as he goes into the election year.
So the date of October the 1st was obviously a significant one, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the PRC. So that's a very symbolic olive branch to extend, but probably an important one to extend before the talks even began. Can there be a greater sense of optimism about these talks going forward now?
I think there can, in part because we haven't seen a whole lot of optimistic signs so far. So far, it's been a lot of bellicose rhetoric from both sides. Chinese officials warning the Chinese people to prepare for a long trade war. President Trump continuing his hard stance on China and on some of their, what he describes as trade abuses. So this is a good sign. It's one of the first good signs we've seen in months, and we'll see if it actually has any material impact. It will factor into the discussions that they have here in Washington, but we'll see if there's actually a deal that can be made between the two sides negotiating.
And Anna, we have seen China lifting or expanding some of those exemptions for tariffs on U.S. goods, but they did not include what's key to President Trump, agricultural purchases. So those are still hit by tariffs from China. What are we seeing in terms of farmers? Because their support will be crucial for the 2020 elections, right?
That's right. It's a very, very important constituency for President Trump. And farmers are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. They have thus far. But it's going to be really hard for them to stick with the president as they begin to feel more concrete impact from these tariffs. On the other hand, the president really wants to make a deal. And in some ways, it doesn't actually matter what the details of the deal are. He just needs to be able to go to the American people, to go to his base of supporters and say, hey, I'm the deal maker. I've made a deal. This is what I've gotten from the Chinese to end this long trade war, and the economy will respond. And that could be enough for him to make the case that he conducted this in a way that wasn't very destructive to both economies.
So 15 days, it could be significant in the context of the impending talks that are scheduled to take place between China and the US at the start of October. For now, let's turn to the Asian markets. Rosalind Chin is joining me live from the Bloomberg studios in Hong Kong. Rosalind, on the back of that update just a couple of hours back from Donald Trump, is there positivity in the Asian markets and everything else that's happening on trade globally?
Well, certainly you can't underestimate the impact of a tweet from President Trump. And indeed, yes, we are seeing the markets here in Asia making gains this morning. We've got the MSCI Asia Pacific up by 0.4% right now. Now, we did see Michael McCarthy from CMC Markets saying, well, this move, really could be more symbolic than actually substantial. However, it is being taken well by investors here. So if we take a look at Japan, we see the Nikkei is making gains of 0.9%. The Topic's up by 0.75%. The yen, of course, has been declining beyond its 108 level for the first time, in fact, since August the 1st, and Treasuries, of course, declined as well. Over here in Hong Kong, though, we do see the Hang Seng Index is pretty much flat. Now, that is partly due to a few factors, but one thing we have been seeing in headlines is this unsolicited bid that Hong Kong Exchange has made for the London Stock Exchange. That has not been very well received by investors. We see that Hong Kong Exchange is falling this morning, down by nearly 3% right now, 2.75 at this point in time, on the back of that unsolicited bid which came yesterday afternoon Hong Kong time. We've also got Cathay Pacific here in Hong Kong falling by about 1.5%. That's after its passenger numbers for the month of August were posted, showing that they fell 11% from last August, which is a pretty big drop there. Of course, Cathay Pacific under pressure because of the protests here in Hong Kong and of pressure from Beijing as well regarding some of its internal senior management movements. So Cathay and Hong Kong exchanges both falling, and Hang Seng as well in the red right now. However, across the border in Shanghai, we do see that those exchanges there are actually making gains right now. The Shanghai Composite up by 0.3%. CSI 300 making gains of more than half of 1% at this moment in time. And finally, Australia, S&P ASX 200 making gains of 0.6%. Most of the sectors there actually making gains this morning, other than anything energy related, and that's partly because of the fall in oil prices overnight. So that's a quick look at what's happening around the region. Ahead of us, we still have the ECB decision, which is coming later today, in which Mario Draghi is widely expected to be announcing cuts and also possibly some stimulus as well. So that is one that many investors are watching today. Back to you.
Thanks so much for that, Rosalind. I do want to talk about oil, which Rosalind mentioned towards the end of what she was saying. And oil prices are actually trading lower following optimism that President Trump is considering easing the sanctions on Iran. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, and its allies are set to meet in Abu Dhabi tomorrow to discuss a host of issues, including Iran and the impending Aramco IPO and its impact on oil prices. James Thornhill of Bloomberg News has the details.
As you say, there is a meeting coming up of OPEC ministers. It's interesting in the perspective that we've had a changing of the guard in Saudi Arabia this week with a new energy minister being installed. But he's actually been at pains to say that there's no major change in stance under his leadership. And certainly the soundings from the Russians as well is that there won't be any major further production cuts announced at this meeting in September. I think the strategy in terms of the Saudis and the Russians, the two nations that really drive this OPEC agenda, I think what they would want to see is how things develop on the trade war front over the remainder of the year. Obviously, signs are a bit more positive on that front. You know, as we were just talking about the 2-week delay to the tariffs from the US, a sign of goodwill there. So things may possibly be moving in a good direction there, which will obviously be positive for the demand outlook for crude, which will be supportive to prices. So we're not going to get any knee-jerk reactions, I don't think, from this meeting in Abu Dhabi. I think that all the signs suggest it will be waiting until December. There's a meeting due up in December, and they might make some harder decisions there if the price continues to fall from here.
Now, the European Central Bank will be meeting later today to discuss whether it wants to continue with further policy easing. And this, remember, is just 9 months after it was considering a withdrawal of monetary stimulus. Enda Karan of Bloomberg News brings you the expectations from Mario Draghi and his team.
So on the ECB front, it's going to be something of a contentious meeting, according to our colleagues in Frankfurt. There's quite a diverse discussion going on in terms of what the ECB should do next. Remember, the Eurozone economy has been hit hard by the trade war. It's also got, of course, the uncertainty around Brexit. China's slowing economy is also clearly a drag on it. So the question is not about whether they will add stimulus, but what kind of stimulus the ECB will add. And there seems to be, among observers, a bit of a consensus that the negative rate will be cut further, but after that, in terms of whether or not they restart QE or by how much they restart QE, seems to be the point that's up for debate. And remember, this is quite a dramatic turnaround. Only 9 months ago, the ECB were looking at something of an exit strategy to pull out of their emergency settings, and yet here we are now, just weeks before Mario Draghi finishes his term. They're pushing right back into stimulus territory.
Right, let's see what else is making headlines across the globe. Sue Keenan of Bloomberg News brings you the first word headlines.
We start with President Trump, who has won a legal victory over his policy for the border with Mexico. The Supreme Court says his administration can enforce a new rule designed to limit who can apply for asylum at the border. The ruling says the policy can remain in place while a legal challenge goes ahead. Lower courts had put the law on hold. Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor both dissented. The latest on Brexit now, the UK government is warning of sweeping chaos and a no-deal Brexit with disruption to trade and financial services and the possibility of public disorder. The document is part of a worst-case scenario called Operation Yellowhammer, and Parliament voted to force Boris Johnson to make it public. The government is also facing legal action, the Scottish Appeals Court ruling that the suspension of Parliament is unlawful. Sources in the White House, meanwhile, say National Security Advisor John Bolton left after arguments with President Trump over easing sanctions on Iran. We're told the president mulled a meeting with Iranian leaders later this month at the UN General Assembly, but was warned against the idea by Bolton. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin agreed with the plan, prompting the president to ask for Bolton's resignation. Well, the idea of independence for Catalonia is back in the news, with hundreds of thousands of people staging a mass rally in Barcelona. The demonstration came just weeks before verdicts in legal cases against 12 separatist leaders. September 11th commemorates the fall of Barcelona in the Spanish War of Succession back in 1714. The secessionist leaders face a range of charges, including rebellion. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Sue Keenan. This is Bloomberg.
All right, let's turn to the markets back home now. Agam Vakil is here to tell you all about that and also what's happening in the futures and options space. Agam, it's been a positive few days now for the markets, and The cues look good from overseas for a positive session in today's today as well. How is it looking at the start of trade?
Right, well, Alex, yesterday we registered the longest gaining streak since March of 2019. So it certainly is it's certainly turning out to be a good trading week, considering 5 straight days of gains. Can we register a 6th? Let's wait and watch. The SGX Nifty certainly is indicating one, at least as far as the start's concerned. As I was mentioning, the Nifty advanced by, again, about a little over 0.25% yesterday as well. We had more strength in the broader market, so positive cues coming in, of course, and the PSU banking index up by a good 3%. As far as your American depository receipts concerned, gains all throughout. Tata Motors showing a lot of strength, as is the case for Vedanta and ICICI Bank. Of course, we'll have to keep in mind that all the auto companies which have a reasonable exposure abroad, as well as a lot of these metal companies, are likely to have advanced because of the easing tensions between the US and for now Iran. But move on and talk about how things have panned out when it comes to your fund flows. It's a positive number, surprise there, and as far as FIs are concerned. But we must remember that we also have the big block deal in ICICI Lombard, which may have very well have had a little bit of a play there. So this could be a one-off. Of course, DIS continue to buy at around 1,132 crores. But, as far as contributors are concerned, Reliance Industries, Maruti Suzuki, SBI, all are giving some amount of support. And Infosys, which actually used to be a support a few days ago, is now turning out to be something which is weighing down on the index. Let's talk about futures and options then. That's where we are looking at very little movement as far as the Nifty futures go. The Nifty banking futures are seeing some amount of accumulation, about 3% increase in open interest there. But moving on to your options, levels, it's still the 10,800 on the lower end. On the higher end, it's 11,200, 400-point range, with, as one might have guessed, where people took the opportunity to write options around the 11,300 call. So moving on, let's also talk about your WIX, because that has come off even further, down another 3%, inching towards the mark of 15, which is a positive. Nifty put call ratio down at around 1.3 against 1.4, and it's in spite of that we've seen a lot of traction as far as stocks are concerned. CESC, Apollo Hospitals. Keep an eye on Apollo Hospitals, because it is in the news as far as the promoter selling stake and raising funds is concerned. Tata Global Beverages, among others, which are also in focus. In terms of stocks which are seeing unwinding, Canara Bank, Ujjivan Financial Services, and Equitas Holding. Both the microfinance companies advancing, so we keep an eye on them as well.
All right, thanks, Agam. Let's stick with stocks that you have to watch out for in trade today. In fact, Somit Sarkar is here to tell you all about the stocks in news. Good morning, Somit. What is on your list today?
Good morning, Alex. On the stocks and news today, firstly, we have SBI and SBI Life Insurance, because SBI, which is the promoter of SBI Life Insurance, has approved the sale of its 3.5% stake or 3.5 crore shares in SBI Life Insurance. Now, the offer for sale is being done by SBI to achieve the minimum public share holding norms, and the floor price set for this offer for sale is 770 rupees per share, which is at a discount of nearly 4% to yesterday's closing price. Secondly, Apollo Hospital will also remain in focus, because the promoter Sunita Reddy will sell nearly 50 lakh shares of up to 725 crore rupees. Now, the floor price set for this stake sale is around 1,450 rupees, which is a discount of nearly 3% compared to yesterday's closing. Now, according to Morgan Stanley, this stake sale, coupled with the insurance deal signed earlier, would bring down the promoter pledged holding in Apollo Hospitals to 20% by the end of 2019 from current 78%. Alchem Laboratories will also remain in focus, because the company has stated that the inspection by US FDA has been now closed, and they have received nearly 4 observations under Form 483 by US FDA for its manufacturing facility in USA. Reliance Capital and Reliance Nippon both will remain in focus, because Reliance Capital has agreed to exercise the oversubscription option of nearly 3.2% stake in Reliance Nippon, in addition to the base sale of around 3.2% stake. Now, on the first day of offer, the demand received from the non-retail category was nearly 1.3 times for Reliance Nippon shares. Walchandra Industries will also remain in focus, because they have signed an agreement agreement with ISRO to supply the equipment for launch vehicle for a contract value of nearly 77 crore rupees. Also, MSTC will remain in focus because they have been appointed as a selling agent to sell all the surplus inventory and equipment of the entire Adani group of companies. Lastly, couple of stocks that will remain in focus because of Bull deal. Firstly, Kalpataru Power Transmission, because ICICI Pru AMC has acquired nearly 8 lakh shares, while Nomura India has acquired nearly 23 lakh shares from the promoters, while ICICI Lombard General Insurance will also remain in focus because Red Bloom Investments just sold 1.2 crore shares in the company yesterday.
Thanks so much for that, Somit. Now, OTT platforms like Netflix and Amazon Prime are constantly growing their subscriber bases in India, and now Apple is jumping into India's streaming market by offering Apple TV Plus at $1.4 per month, which is just about 100 rupees a month. Take a look. Now, with inventory levels rising significantly in the market, I was telling you about stories that you'll find on the website. In fact, on YouTube, I was telling you guys that you must read this story about inventory levels being 7 times higher in the month of August. But let's talk a little bit more about the auto sector. Union Minister Nitin Gadkari yesterday said that it is up to the Finance Ministry as well as state governments and the Goods and Services Tax Council to decide on a GST rate cut on the automotive sector. He said, though, that a vehicle scrappage policy that also covers two-wheelers is in the works and will be launched soon. His comments come about a week after he assured leaders of the automotive industry that he would take up the issue of a GST rate cut on cars to 18% from 28%, which is what it is right now. In another story, Blackstone Group is in talks to invest 15 billion rupees, that's 1,500 crore rupees, in a venture with All Cargo Logistics to build warehouses in India. That's a Bloomberg story quoting unnamed sources. The report states that Blackstone is looking to hold 51% of the proposed joint venture. That's all you need to know going into trade today, but do stay tuned. There's a lot more coming up in just a short while. This is Bloomberg Quint.